My name is Enos Calloway, and on the 9th day of my honeymoon, a stranger from a title company called my cell phone from 6,000 miles away to ask why I hadn't yet signed the paperwork to sell my own house. I was sitting on a stone balcony in the Algarve, sunburned across the shoulders, watching my husband order 2 coffees in badly pronounced Portuguese when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. I'm glad I didn't. Mrs. Calloway? This is Noor Kalantari with Coastal Title. I'm calling to confirm receipt of the signed disclosure package for the sale of the property at 214 Larkspur Lane. We have Mr. Calloway's signature on file, but we're missing yours, and closing is scheduled for the 22nd. I remember asking her to repeat the address, not because I hadn't heard it, but because I needed a second version of the sentence to exist before I let myself believe the first one. Larkspur Lane was our house. The house Desmond and I had spent 4 months renovating a kitchen in. The house we'd left 11 days earlier with the porch light on a timer and a note taped to the fridge for the neighbor watering our tomato plants. Nobody had told us it was for sale. Nobody had asked. Desmond had bought that house 3 years before we met, a fixer-upper on a quiet street outside Richmond, using a loan backed by his military service. He'd been a combat engineer in the Army National Guard, and during a 9-month deployment overseas the year before he bought the house, he'd given his father, Walter, a general power of attorney so someone could manage his finances while he was unreachable for weeks at a stretch, pay his storage unit bill, handle a dispute with his old landlord, sign for a car repair if something broke down while he was gone. It was a practical decision made by a 26-year-old who trusted his father and didn't think much about what it would mean 5 years later. When Desmond came home, the deployment ended, the storage unit was closed, the landlord dispute was resolved, and the power of attorney sat in a drawer in his father's house, unused and, crucially, never formally revoked. Desmond told me about it once, early in our relationship, the way you mention an old key you still technically have to an apartment you no longer live in. Neither of us thought about it again. We met at a mutual friend's barbecue 2 years after Desmond moved into that house alone. He'd shown up with a bag of charcoal because the host had texted the group chat that morning saying they'd run out. And I remember thinking that was such a small, unglamorous kind of thoughtfulness that it stuck with me longer than anything clever he said that afternoon. He was the kind of person who fixed things before you asked him to. A wobbly fence post, a friend's flat tire, the terrible drainage in his own backyard that had been flooding his tomato bed every spring until he spent a weekend regrading it by hand. Our first real date was 2 weeks later, and he spent most of it asking me questions instead of talking about himself, which I'd never experienced with anyone before and didn't fully trust until the 3rd or 4th time it happened, and I realized it wasn't a technique, it was just how he was built. We dated for 2 years before he proposed, slow by some standards, but neither of us was in a hurry to rush past the part where we were still learning each other. He proposed on that same porch, kneeling on the step he'd rebuilt himself the summer before. And when we got engaged, we decided together to refinance the house and add my name to the deed as a joint tenant, so that Larkspur Lane would belong to both of us the same way our marriage would. It wasn't a decision either of us treated lightly. Desmond told me the night before we signed that the house was the one thing that had always felt entirely his, the only proof he had that the deployment years hadn't cost him everything, and that giving me half of it wasn't a formality to him. It was the biggest thing he had to offer. We signed those papers on a Tuesday afternoon at a title company 2 miles from the house, and I remember feeling for the first time in my adult life like I owned something permanent. Desmond's parents, Walter and Sheila, had a way of treating family money as a shared account that only they had the password to. It wasn't dramatic most of the time. It was small things that added up if you paid attention, which for a long time I didn't. Sheila would mention, almost as an aside, that Walter's hardware store had a slow month, and that Desmond had helped out, the way you'd mention the weather. Desmond would get quiet whenever the subject of his father's business came up, and I learned not to press it, because pressing it usually ended with him saying some version of, "It's complicated, they're my parents," in a tone that closed the conversation rather than opened it. I didn't know, in those early years, how literally complicated it was. I didn't know there was still a legal document sitting in a drawer that gave his father the power to act as if he were Desmond, on paper, without Desmond's knowledge, whenever his father decided it was necessary. Walter's hardware store had been losing money for 2 years by the time of our wedding, squeezed by a big chain store that opened 14 miles away and undercut his prices on everything from lumber to light bulbs. Sheila mentioned it at our engagement dinner, in passing, the way she mentioned most financial trouble, framed as a temporary rough patch rather than the structural collapse it actually was. Desmond wrote his father a check for $4,000 that winter, a bridge, Walter called it, just to get through the slow season. I didn't love it, but it was Desmond's money and his family, and I told myself it wasn't my place to weigh in on every dollar. I noticed a smaller version of the same pattern the year before, at a birthday dinner for Sheila, when Walter mentioned almost cheerfully that he'd borrowed the truck for a delivery run, and it took me a moment to realize he meant Desmond's truck, taken from the driveway without asking while Desmond was at work, returned with an empty gas tank and a scrape along the tailgate that Walter never mentioned, and Desmond noticed 3 days later. Desmond laughed it off at the time, said his father had always been like that, said it was easier to let the small things go than to keep score over a truck. I understood the impulse. I also remember thinking, quietly, that a man who didn't ask before taking a truck probably wouldn't ask before taking something larger if the opportunity ever presented itself. I didn't say that out loud. I wish, in hindsight, that I had. 3 weeks before the wedding, Walter asked Desmond to meet him at the store after closing. Alone, no wives, he'd said, like it was a joke, though nobody laughed. Desmond came home late that night and told me his father had asked him to consider restructuring some of the store's debt, using the house as collateral for a new loan, just until the slow season passed, just as a safety net in case things got worse before they got better. Desmond had said no. He'd told his father the house wasn't only his to offer anymore, that Enos would need to be part of any decision like that, and Walter had gone quiet in a way Desmond described as more unsettling than if he'd argued. I didn't think much of it at the time beyond feeling a flicker of unease, the kind you register and then set down because there's a wedding to finish planning and seating charts to finalize, and 100 smaller emergencies competing for your attention. I know now that the quiet wasn't Walter accepting no. It was Walter deciding he'd stop asking. We got married in June and left 12 days later for a 3-week honeymoon, 2 weeks in Portugal and 1 in Spain, the kind of trip we'd been saving towards since before we got engaged. We told almost no one our full itinerary, partly because we wanted the privacy and partly, if I'm honest, because Desmond had a habit of getting phone calls from his father at inconvenient moments, and we both wanted 3 weeks where that wasn't going to happen. It happened anyway. It just came through a title company instead of a phone call from Walter directly, which in hindsight was the entire point. After I hung up with Noor Kalantari, I sat very still on that balcony for what felt like a long time, watching my husband cross the street with 2 paper cups of coffee, completely unaware that his childhood home, our home, was 9 days from closing on a sale neither of us had authorized. I waited until he sat down to tell him, because I wanted to watch his face when he heard it, and because some small, ungenerous part of me needed to see whether he already knew. He didn't know. I want to be clear about that, because for about 40 minutes I wasn't sure, and it's an ugly thing to doubt your husband on your honeymoon, even for 40 minutes. His face went through something I'd never seen on him before, confusion curdling fast into something colder, and he asked me to say the address again, and then he asked me to say the closing date again, and then he put his coffee down without drinking any of it and said, "My father." We spent the rest of that afternoon on our hotel room floor with both of our laptops open, using hotel Wi-Fi that kept dropping every few minutes, piecing together what had happened while an ocean and 6 time zones sat between us and the answer. The listing was real. It had gone live 19 days earlier, 4 days before our wedding, on a regional real estate site, photographed by an agent neither of us had ever met, staged with furniture that wasn't ours, moved in by someone who had access to our house while we were finishing wedding preparations and never noticed. I scrolled through the photographs on that hotel bed with a strange, dislocated feeling, recognizing our kitchen counters and our bedroom window, and in one photo, the edge of a bookshelf Desmond had built himself, all of it staged with rented furniture and a bowl of decorative lemons on the counter that had never once been in our house in real life. The listing described the home as motivated seller, quick close preferred, a phrase Desmond read aloud twice, like saying it again might make it mean something different the second time. There was an offer already accepted, a young couple from 2 counties over, financing approved, closing scheduled for the 22nd, 11 days out. The agent's name was on the listing, along with a headshot of a young woman who looked barely older than we were, smiling in front of a different house entirely. A stock template photo she probably hadn't thought twice about using. We found the buyers' names too, listed in a public permit search Desmond ran out of habit from his contracting work. A young couple who'd apparently already scheduled an inspection for the following week, a date that had come and gone 3 days before we ever found out any of this was happening. I remember feeling something unexpected in that moment, underneath the anger, a kind of grief on their behalf, for a couple who had no idea they were about to lose a house that was never actually for sale to begin with. Desmond called his father from the hotel balcony at 11 at night local time, which was 5 in the afternoon back home, and I stood close enough to hear both sides of the conversation through the phone's speaker because he wanted me to hear it, and because I don't think either of us wanted to be alone with what Walter was about to say. "You weren't supposed to find out until it was already done," Walter said, and there was no apology in his voice, only irritation, the specific irritation of a plan interrupted rather than a wrong exposed. "The store's going under, Desmond. I needed something fast, and the house has equity sitting in it doing nothing. I was going to make it right. I was going to pay you back once things stabilized." "You can't sell my house," Desmond said. "You don't have the right to sell my house." "I have power of attorney," Walter said. "It's still valid. I checked. Nobody ever filed anything to end it." That sentence is the one I've turned over the most since. I checked, not I forgot it existed and made a terrible mistake in a moment of panic. He had checked, deliberately, to confirm that an old document, signed by a 26-year-old before a deployment nobody thought would matter years later, still gave him legal cover to attempt something he knew his son would never have agreed to. Desmond asked how he'd gotten a real estate agent to list the house without ever speaking to him directly. Walter said the agent was a family friend's daughter, new to the business, eager for a listing, and that he'd told her he had full authority to handle the sale on his son's behalf, which, on paper, with the power of attorney still active, wasn't technically a lie. The title company had accepted his signature on Desmond's half of the disclosure package because the document authorizing it was, in the narrowest legal sense, real. What Walter hadn't accounted for was that the house wasn't solely Desmond's anymore. It hadn't been for 2 years. The power of attorney covered Desmond. It said nothing about me, and no closing could complete without my signature too, which was the only reason Noor Kalantari had ever called at all. Walter's plan had a hole in it exactly my size, and he hadn't known it was there until the title company found it for him. I called an attorney the next morning, a woman named Farah Whitlock, who a friend from my physical therapy program had used for an unrelated property dispute 2 years earlier. I described the situation in the calmest voice I could manage while sitting on a hotel bed in a country where it was 3 in the morning back home, and she told me the first thing we needed to do, faster than anything else, was file a formal, written revocation of the power of attorney with the county recorder's office, the same office where the original document had been filed 9 years earlier. A power of attorney doesn't expire just because the reason for it is gone. It expires when the principal says, in writing, on the record, that it's over. Nobody had ever said that. Desmond signed a revocation electronically from a hotel business center that afternoon, and Farah had it filed and recorded within 2 days, a document with a timestamp that would now sit permanently in the same public record where Walter's authority had lived, canceling it out. The second thing Farah did was contact Coastal Title directly, in writing, notifying them that the power of attorney used to authorize the seller's signature was in the process of formal revocation, and that the true joint owner of the property, myself, had never consented to the sale in any form. Noor Kalantari, to her credit, froze the file the same day she received the notice, before closing could proceed on the 22nd, and reached out to the buyer's agent to explain that the transaction was on hold pending a legal review. We stayed in Portugal. I want to say that plainly, because it would have been easy to cut the trip short and fly home to stand in our own driveway and yell at Walter in person, and there were hours where that felt like the only appropriate response to what was happening. But Farah made it clear that our physical presence wasn't going to move the legal process any faster, and Desmond, somewhere in the middle of that terrible first day, said something I've held on to since. He said, "I'm not going to let my father take this trip too." He'd already tried to take the house. I wasn't going to hand him the honeymoon as well. So we finished the week in the Algarve, and then Spain, checking in with Farah by phone every 2 or 3 days instead of every hour, learning to hold the anger at a manageable distance instead of letting it swallow the whole trip. It wasn't easy. There was a night in Seville, in a rented apartment with a view of the cathedral, where Desmond sat on the edge of the bed for a long time without saying anything, and I sat next to him and didn't fill the silence, because some things don't need filling, they just need someone else in the room while you sit with them. When we got home, 7 days after the original closing date had come and gone unmet, the house was still ours, technically, though the sense of it as an entirely safe place took longer to come back than the paperwork did. Farah had spent the last week of our trip pulling something else, almost as an afterthought, once the immediate emergency was contained, a full accounting of every transaction Walter had authorized under the power of attorney since Desmond's deployment ended. What she found wasn't a single dramatic theft. It was a pattern, small enough each time to explain away, large enough in total to change how I understood the last several years of Desmond's finances. A $4,000 transfer described as a loan 2 winters ago, never repaid. A car repair paid from Desmond's account for a vehicle that turned out to belong to Walter's brother. A $2,200 withdrawal the same month the hardware store's lease came up for renewal. None of these were things Desmond had authorized in the moment. Some of them he'd noticed and been told were emergencies, one-time things, and believed because that's what you do when the person telling you is your father. Over 3 years, the total came to just under $46,000, moved through an authority that was supposed to exist only for 9 months during a deployment that had ended long before any of it happened. We didn't file criminal charges. Farah walked us through what that would have looked like: a fiduciary breach claim, potentially theft by an agent under power of attorney, depending on how the district attorney's office chose to characterize the pattern, and Desmond spent 2 days sitting with the decision before telling me he didn't want to watch his father go through a criminal proceeding, whatever he deserved. What we did instead was pursue a civil demand for repayment through Farah, structured as a formal settlement rather than a lawsuit, requiring Walter to sign a promissory note for the full amount with a repayment schedule, secured against a piece of undeveloped land he still owned outright from before the store ever opened. It wasn't the version of justice that would have made for the most satisfying ending. It was the version that let Desmond sleep at night, which mattered more. The real estate agent, A woman new enough to the business that I believe her when she says she didn't fully understand what she was looking at, filed a complaint against her own broker's insurance to cover the buyer's costs once the deal collapsed, and separately faced a review from the state licensing board for failing to verify the full ownership history of the property before listing it, since a basic title search would have shown my name on the deed alongside Desmond's from the start. Farah told us later that the board's findings weren't harsh. A formal reprimand and a requirement to complete an additional continuing education course on seller authority verification, rather than a suspension, since the investigators seemed to agree she'd been misled by a family member rather than complicit in the deception. I found myself hoping, when Farah told us that the reprimand was enough to make her double-check every listing for the rest of her career without following her into something that cost her the career altogether. She wasn't the architect of what happened. She was the tool Walter used, confident and practiced enough in the language of family authority that a newer agent had no obvious reason to question him. And I've made my peace with the fact that some of the people who get pulled into a plan like this one are more careless than cruel. The buyers, the young couple who'd been approved for financing and were 9 days from what they thought was their first home, got their earnest money back in full once the sale collapsed, and Coastal Title sent them a formal letter explaining the ownership discrepancy that had halted the closing. Farah reached out to their attorney directly, unprompted, to make sure they understood the situation wasn't the result of anything they'd done, in case they needed that in writing for whatever came next in their own home search. I think about them sometimes, a couple I've never met, who spent 19 days imagining a life inside my kitchen, picking paint colors for a nursery that was never theirs to paint, before finding out the sale was never something the seller had full authority to make. I looked up the house listing once more, months later, out of a curiosity I couldn't quite talk myself out of, and found it gone from the site entirely. No record it had ever been there at all, as if the 19 days had simply been folded back into the version of events where none of this happened. I hope they found their house. I hope it was easier than ours. We saw Walter in person for the first time since the phone call from the hotel balcony at a repayment meeting Farah arranged at her office, neutral ground, 3 weeks after we landed. He looked smaller across a conference table than he had in my memory of him at the head of every holiday dinner for the last 4 years. Though I don't think he'd actually changed size, I think I'd just stopped needing to make room for him the way I used to. He tried, in the first 5 minutes, to frame the whole thing as a misunderstanding that had spiraled further than he intended, a bridge loan that got complicated, and Farah cut him off before he finished the sentence, sliding the bank records across the table, the $4,000, the car repair for his brother's vehicle, the $2,200 withdrawal timed to the lease renewal, $46,000 laid out in black and white in front of him like a ledger he'd never expected anyone to actually read line by line. "I was going to pay all of it back," Walter said, and for the first time his voice had something close to shame in it rather than irritation. "You've said that about $4,000 for 2 years, Desmond said. I stopped believing it works that way." Walter looked at me then, maybe hoping I'd be the one to soften the room the way I sometimes had at family dinners in the past, smoothing over whatever tension he'd created so everyone could get back to eating. I didn't soften it. I told him that the house wasn't a safety net for his business, it was where I intended to raise a family someday, and that whatever love existed between him and his son wasn't going to be enough to make me forget that he'd tried to sell it out from under both of us while we were on our honeymoon. He didn't have an answer for that. He signed the promissory note before we left the room. Sheila called me twice in the 2 months after we got home, both times to ask, in a voice that managed to sound wounded rather than apologetic, why we were being so hard on Walter when he'd only been trying to save the family business, when the house had equity just sitting there doing nothing, when we were young and had time to build it back. I told her both times that the house wasn't equity sitting there doing nothing. It was where we lived. It was the thing we'd stood in a title company and signed our names to as a joint promise to each other, and nobody, including Walter, had the right to decide unilaterally that our promise was a resource to be liquidated whenever his business needed rescuing. She didn't have an answer for that either time. She just said she hoped we'd come around eventually, the way people say that when they mean they hope the consequences eventually stop being inconvenient for them. Desmond and I filed a new revocation notice with the county the week we got home, even though the first one Farah filed remotely was already valid, just so there would be no ambiguity anywhere in the public record about where the authority to act on either of our behalf now begins and ends. It exists nowhere but with each other. We also sat down together and rewrote our estate documents from scratch, this time with both our names on everything that could possibly be misread later. No old drawers with forgotten paperwork, no permissions granted at 26 that could outlive their purpose by a decade. Walter has made 2 payments on the promissory note so far, on time, through Farah's office rather than directly to us, which was Desmond's condition and one I understood completely. We see him and Sheila at holidays, briefly, at a length that feels manageable rather than warm. Desmond still calls his mother on her birthday. He hasn't called his father except through the attorney since the day we got home from Spain, and I don't know if that's permanent. I know it's necessary for as long as it takes for a $46,000 note to get repaid, and for trust, if it comes back at all, to come back on its own schedule instead of anyone else's. The neighbor who'd been watering our tomato plants told us, when we finally got home, that a moving truck had idled outside the house for almost 20 minutes one afternoon while we were away, before driving off without unloading anything, and that she'd assumed we'd hired movers for some renovation project and thought nothing of it. I don't know exactly what that truck was for. I've chosen not to find out. Some details I've decided I don't need in order to understand what happened. I only need the ones that tell me how close it came and how it was stopped. Ordinary life took longer to feel ordinary again than I expected. For a few months after we got home, I'd catch myself checking the county recorder's website on my phone during lunch breaks, just to confirm the revocation was still there, still recorded, still doing its quiet, permanent work in the background of our lives. Desmond replaced the porch light timer with a smart one he could check from his phone. Not because the timer had ever been the problem, but because it gave him something small and mechanical to control in a season where so much had felt out of his hands. We hosted Thanksgiving that year, our first as a married couple, and I remember standing in the kitchen watching him carve a turkey at the counter Walter had once tried to sell out from under both of us, and thinking that this ordinary, unremarkable evening was the thing that had actually been at stake the whole time. Not the equity, not the number on a settlement sheet, just this. I think about that balcony sometimes, the coffee going cold in Desmond's hand, the exact moment his face changed when he understood what his father had done. I think about how close it came to working, how 19 days of a listing sat online, viewed by strangers, walked through by a couple who thought they were buying their first home, all while we were an ocean away eating grilled sardines and believing our biggest decision that month was which beach to visit next. It worked as long as it did because Walter was counting on something specific. Not that we'd never find out, but that by the time we did, it would already be too late to stop. He miscalculated by exactly one signature, mine. If someone had asked me directly, before any of this, whether I'd have helped Walter and Sheila if the hardware store was really failing, I think I would have said yes, within reason, the way you help family when they ask honestly instead of taking without asking. That's the part that still sits strangest with me, stranger even than the $46,000. He never tested whether the honest version would have worked. He decided in advance that it wouldn't, and skipped straight to a plan that only needed one signature to fall apart, because it turned out he'd never really counted me as someone whose name mattered on that deed at all. I've wondered, too, what would have happened if Noor Kalantari had been less thorough that week, if she'd simply accepted the paperwork Walter's agent submitted and let the file move forward on the assumption that everything in order looked like everything in order. Closings happen every day on the strength of people doing their jobs carefully enough to notice the one signature that's missing. I try to remember that when I feel the old anger creeping back in on a quiet evening, that the system meant to protect us actually worked. Not because it's perfect, but because one person in an office I've never seen picked up a phone instead of moving a file forward on autopilot. So here's what I still find myself asking. Some nights, when the house is quiet and the porch light Desmond rewired himself clicks on with the dusk like it's supposed to, if the people who are supposed to trust you enough to ask instead choose to take, believing they'll be forgiven before they're ever caught, what do you actually owe them once the paperwork proves they were wrong? And if a single signature is the only thing standing between you and losing everything you built together, how much more careful should any of us be about whose name is actually on the page? Desmond planted a second tomato bed that spring, past the one he'd regraded years earlier, and told me, half joking, that he wanted enough tomatoes that giving some away would feel like generosity instead of obligation. I understood what he meant without him having to explain it further. We still send Sheila a plate of them every August, still let Walter's birthday show up on the calendar, still leave room for the version of his family that might, someday, learn to ask instead of take. We just don't leave the house unattended for it anymore, not on paper, and not in any of the places that matter. This video is a work of fiction, created for entertainment and reflection. Any resemblance to real individuals or events is coincidental. If a story like this one has ever felt close to your own life, I hope it reminded you that the documents sitting quietly in old drawers matter more than most people realize, and that it is never too late to make sure your name is exactly where it needs to be.